Hey there, everyone. It's Friday. It's the end of another week, and so celebrate. I hope you've had an awesome, fantastic week. Not quite 2 weeks ago, I turned 50, and I shared with some of you over the last couple of weeks how much I really wasn't looking forward to turning 50 years old. But because of everything that we have going on right now, my birthday was pretty low key, and that was just fine with me. Now, I did have a couple of loving friends from RCC who gave me a special birthday present. It was a jumbo pack of bathroom tissue. Only when you celebrate your 50th birthday during a pandemic can you truly appreciate getting bathroom tissue as a gift. But anyway, on my birthday, I was just kind of thinking about how much had changed and then how much remained the same over the course of my lifetime. There's a lot that's different, and then there's a lot that's still the same. I remember when we got our first microwave. Then we got a VCR, and then we had cable television that was installed at our house for the first time. I mean, you could actually watch like 30 channels, and you didn't have to turn the dial to adjust the outside TV antenna. Some of you will remember the luxury in that. I remember playing records, and then it was cassettes, and then it was CDs. Now, that was quite the jump right there to go from records to CDs. I also remember getting my first Walkman. Do you remember that? That thing played cassettes, right? Some of you will remember those things. You basically had this big cassette player that you hooked to your belt, but the thing was so heavy that it wanted to pull your pants down whenever you walked around with it. And then I remember getting my first Walkman that played CDs, and that thing was totally useless because every time you took a step, it would skip to the next song. I remember the first time that we went to a self-serve gas station. So there's a lot that's different today, but then there's a lot that's also the same, and that's over the course of 50 years. Now think about the past 60 days. There's a lot that's different, right? Wearing a mask in public, not eating in our favorite restaurants, waiting in line to go to Sam's Club, or keeping 6 feet between you and someone else. And then you've got no sports and no concerts, no golf, no fishing, no fitness clubs, no dropping off and picking up kids at school. Think about the church for just a second. No Sunday morning coffee. Only one online service. Virtual Bible studies in small groups. You worship in your living room. Donuts for communion. I had a friend send me a text right before communion this past Sunday, and he said that he was ready for communion, and he had sent me a picture of an iced donut. Now, I'm not sure if he was serious or not, but it just illustrates how different things are in the church right now. And that's just in the past 60 days. And so there's a lot that has changed, and then there's a lot that hasn't changed. Much is different, but much is also the same. Here's what hasn't changed. Here's what is still the same. Jesus. Here's what Paul says in Colossians chapter 1, referring to Jesus. He says, "He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For by him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities. All things were created by him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. And he is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning and the firstborn from among the dead, so that in everything he might have the supremacy. For God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through his blood shed on the cross." Here's what I believe. We may be doing things a little differently in the church right now. We're doing things that we weren't even thinking about 60 days ago. And so we may be doing things a little differently right now, but the church is still the unstoppable church because the unstoppable Jesus is still the head of the church. We may be worshiping in our homes. We may be doing Bible studies on Zoom. You may have used donuts for communion, but Jesus is still the head of the church. And if the church is people, right, if the church is us, and I don't think there's ever been a more powerful statement than right now, because we're seeing this and we're experiencing this firsthand. If the church is us, if the church is people, then Jesus being the head of the church means that he is the head of our lives. And so there may be a lot of things that will change, but that will never change. And so if Jesus is the head of our lives, then I want us to just take a moment and I want us to focus on who we see when we look at Jesus. Maybe one of the things that I appreciate most about what Paul writes here about Jesus in Colossians 1 is that Jesus is the image of God. Jesus is the one who clearly displays the greatness of God. Jesus is the one who is the glory of the gospel. Jesus is the one who came to establish God's rule. Jesus is the one who takes away the sins of the world. Jesus is the one who is the Son of the living God. Paul is very clear as to who Jesus is. Paul wants to make sure that there's no confusion. In fact, listen to 3 of these verses in Colossians 1 again. Look at what Paul says. He says, he is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For by him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities. All things were created by him and for him. For God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him. Paul says that Jesus is the image of the invisible God, and he was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him. I think it's important that we understand what Paul's saying here. Jesus is not a duplicate of God. Jesus is not a copy of God. Jesus is not sort of like God. No, Paul is saying that Jesus is God. Jesus is the original. Paul says that Jesus is the image of the invisible God. Now that word for image there that Paul uses, it literally means that God is fully revealed in Jesus. And so if you want to know who God is, then you have to look to Jesus. A little bit later on in Colossians, here's what Paul says. He says, for in Christ all the fullness of the deity lives in bodily form. You know what? Because all the fullness of God dwells in him, there is no one above Jesus. Paul even tells us this in these Colossians 1 verses that we're looking at. In verse 18, here's what Paul says. He says, he is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning and the firstborn from among the dead, so that in everything he might have the supremacy. Jesus has the supremacy in everything. In other words, he is above everyone and above everything. And while there may be many things that are different in our world and in the church right now, this will never change. Jesus is supreme. He is the head of creation. He is the head of the church. He is the head of this church. He is the head of our lives. And so, who do you see when you look at Jesus? Do you see the one who is God? Jesus said, I and the Father are one. Do you see the one who is the Lord of all? Revelation 17 says, the Lamb is the Lord of lords and King of kings. Do you see the one who is completely holy? The Hebrews writer tells us that Jesus is the one who is holy, blameless, pure, set apart from sinners, exalted above the heavens. Do you see the one who has the authority to judge the world? Paul said, we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, that each one may receive what is due him for the things done while in the body, whether good or bad. Do you see the one who alone can save us? In Acts 4, referring to Jesus, Peter said, salvation is found in no one else, for there is no other name under heaven given to men by which we must be saved. Do you see the one you will bow down to one day? Again, referring to Jesus, Paul wrote, God exalted him to the highest place and gave him the name that is above every name, that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. Do you see the one who is the first and the last? Jesus said, I am the Alpha and the Omega, the first and the last, the beginning and the end. And so, who do you see when you look at Jesus? Is he the Lord of all, completely holy, the judge of the world, the one who saves us, the one that we'll bow down to, and the first and the last? Friends, Jesus is the image of God. I look forward to gathering together with you online this Sunday at 9:15, because on Sunday, we're just going to worship. I'll be here in this worship center with 7 or 8 other folks. I'm going to miss seeing you. I'm going to miss hearing about your family. I'm going to miss seeing you sitting in the same seat that you sit in every week, right? I'm going to miss watching you fall asleep during my sermon. I see you when I'm up there preaching, right? I'm going to miss your encouragement and your questions and your requests for me to pray for you. But I'll be here in the worship center while you may be in your living room or your family room, or maybe you'll be in your kitchen, or maybe you'll be in the basement, maybe in the bedroom. And you may have crackers and juice to use for communion, or it might be an iced donut. Much has changed, but one thing remains the same. On Sunday, it's not about where we worship, it's about who we worship. And we'll gather together on Sunday morning to worship Jesus. We'll gather together to worship the one who is the head of the church and the head of our lives. We'll gather together to worship the one who is above everyone and above everything. His name is Jesus. And so maybe a lot has changed, but this will always remain the same. And so let's focus on Jesus as we go through this weekend, can't we? Have a fantastic weekend, and I can't wait to be together online as we worship Jesus on Sunday morning.